Some applications need to support multiple languages. So in this video, I'll cover the localization setup in a Blazor web application. I'm going to cover the scenario in which a page visitor or a web application visitor can select their preferred language and from then on use the application in that language. I'll implement this setup in an interactive Blazor web application, not the static variation, since that will likely need another approach that is more in line with the default ASP.NET Core localization setup. For that, I'll follow the official documentation page of Microsoft, and afterwards I'll also present you with an alternative, more of a do-it-yourself approach. And after that, I'll talk a bit more about the practicality of having those translations and how do you translate validation messages. I'll put the source code for this project on my Patreon, so head to patreon.com/kissstupid and become a member. There's currently a huge price decrease on the .NET 8 brand website project, $20. And if you become a bronze member on my Patreon, you temporarily can get free access. So I scaffolded a Blazor web app with the auto render mode, so I have both interactive WebAssembly as interactive server enabled. To follow along, you can either pick a Blazor WebAssembly project, standalone or pre-rendered, or you could follow along with a Blazor project using the interactive server. So in the documentation, the first thing adding to the CS_proj file is this Blazor WebAssembly load all globalization data. I did that, of course, in the client project by going to the project file and here. For the next thing is to add the access to the local storage, and I'll do that in the server-side project, I think in the app.razor, which contains the HTML markup, and underneath I added a script, the Blazor culture, just copied in what is in the docs. And this has a get and a set method we'll use later when the user picks the preferred language. You could have used the JS runtime for this as well. And then the next thing in the client project, in the imports.razor, we'll add make sure the interop is there. And then we need the system.globalization. And then we can finally go to the program CS and of the client project, in which we replace the await builder.build run async with all of this. Let's see. And all this code does is tries to get the culture from the local storage. So every user selected the language, after which that language, well, that choice gets stored into the local storage. Now, an app startup, we're trying to get that value out. If there is a value, we'll set that as the culture. If there isn't, we'll just set a default culture, in this case, English. We've got this add localization at the top. It's important to also add this to the server-side project if you're running some kind of pre-rendered setup or the auto render mode. So in the program CS of the server-side project, I also added this services.localization, and know that you can pass some options. For example, if you need the resource path to be elsewhere, then you can specify your path. By default, it looks for the localization folder, which I made in the client project in here. And this contains resource files. We'll talk more about that later, which just contains the key value pairs, the translations. The next thing I'll do is create that culture selector, so the language selection component, and I put that, I think, in the layout. Culture selector, I also copied that from the official Microsoft documentation pages, which you can just see here, which uses the JS runtime, and the navigation manager contains a select box which will hold the supported cultures, which are specified in here. I added a few more, some Dutch, some French, some German, and then the options will just contain that, and it's bound to another property, culture, which is this private property below. So since it's bound, every time the selection changes, this value of the culture property will change. And they used the setter to check whether the incoming value does not equal the current culture. So, well, there's no use if the selection somehow ends up being the same as the already selected culture. So only if it differs, we want to update the local storage with the newly selected language, and then it kind of does a force reload, so it triggers a reload of the entire web application, which will then, of course, on app startup, check for that updated Blazor culture and set that as the default one. And from then on, the entire application should be in the preferred language. On the main layout, and I replaced that about link with the culture selector. And yeah, that's all there is to it. And then if we take a look at the home razor, that's already implemented at iString localizer coming from the add localization. And it has the home resource. We'll see that in a bit. And yeah, it's usually called lock. And then you kind of target the key of which translation you want to get. So could be either in Dutch, in English, or in French or in German, depending on which language is selected. Okay, localization is the name of the folder. That's what by default what the Blazor setup is going to look for. If you want to use another name, you may have to specify the resources path that I showed you before. But yeah, if you don't have to, don't lose time on that. And then I created a home resource with the intention of holding the translations just for the home component or the home page, and a shared resource, because not all of the some translations will be applicable to more sections of the application, to multiple pages, multiple components, and so on. These resource files can be created by simply right-clicking, add a resource file, and then you give it a name, something logical that relates to either the page, the component, or the shared one. If it's a resource file for a specific language, then you add the culture code, shared resource. It's going to have page title, then default culture. I'm not sure whether that needs to be the actual translation or the culture code. Then English, Dutch, that's those extra ENL resource files that I added. So my home resource, yeah, if you take a look at the code, that's kind of an XML markup. And it has this page title, but it's not showing up. So for some reason, this show only problems was toggled for, and that was why I didn't see my home resources value. So I've got the page title, the default culture, I set it to the country code, the translation for English, and for the Dutch label. All we need to do now is run the application. One thing I forgot to mention maybe is make sure you have the correct NuGet packages as well. I think the extension localization is required. I see that I didn't translate these menu items, but it's okay. And then you get this language selector, culture selector. So you can say English US, and then it's going to, if I select that, it's going to reload and should show me the English translation. Then I've got French, but I don't, okay, now we see the NUS, so that's the default value, probably had to contain either home or something, not the culture code. Then for German, because I didn't add those resource files. So simply going to say add resource file, going to call this home resource dot, and what was it? French. Then you get that out of the box, that's fine. Let's also add the German one. Okay, cool. And let's see now, German and French should be added. So yeah, I have no idea what German really is. I'm just gonna say house in German, I think, and the same for French. So let's run that. Okay, so now we see maison for French and house for German. For some reason, it's quickly switching to Dutch, which is the server-side rendering happening. Okay, so that's all there is to it for an interactive Blazor client-side application. And let's now talk about improvements. So the first thing would be these string keys. I prefer a strongly typed approach because, well, we can easily write some typos in there, or let's say your application grows and grows and grows, and these key names are scattered all across your application, and suddenly the key name changes, or there's a typo or whatever. It's not that easy to modify if it's in a dozen different places. And then another inconvenience would be that the localization, the translations now live in the project. So every time I have to maybe fix small typos, I might have to redeploy the entire application for that. So that's not ideal. But if we want to add new translations, we'll likely will have to redeploy our application to see those added translations on the live application. What I've seen multiple times is that these translations are moved to a content delivery network, a CDN, and then it's just included on the HTML page as a script tag or link tag, and it's usually in a JSON format containing having a nested object for each language with all of the keys and so on. But also with that approach, you might still have to target the label, the translation, by using the stringified key. We can of course create our own classes that can then be used to target that in a strongly typed manner. Class or translation class dot page title, for example. Another idea might be, if we're only using the translation in .NET projects, you could move it into a class library and then deploy that class library, publish that as a NuGet package. Maybe that way you have versioning and it's outside of your project, so you a separate deployment or publish cycle. And you could include the statically typed approach inside that package. And a similar approach may be possible by using a blob storage provider like Azure Blob Storage or something else. Just put the translations on there. The important thing is, of course, availability, maybe versioning, and I think to separate that out of your project so you can deploy independently. So I'm now going to go over my custom implementation, and I put the translations in a separate class library so I could deploy that as a NuGet package if I wanted to. And it has a translations class, which is simply just has one method that is going to return the language class according to the past language static class. The languages, yeah, I'm going to define them in here, English, Dutch, and then an actual language class is going to contain the properties. So yeah, maybe the properties, and then for example in the English version, just get the English translation. See, we can do it like that. But to make that work, so that's a statically typed approach. So then in my component, I could go and say, let's see, home. Then I'm gonna show you the interface later, but I could add the home translations, pass down the selected language from the state. So it's stored in a property on the state, but it's set by checking the local storage as well before we set it in here. Anyway, then we can just use home translations dot page title. So now the challenge here was to make sure that we have a consistency between these three languages. So whenever the English one gets extra properties, we need to make sure the Dutch one has the same ones. And that's why I use these interfaces. So my IDE is going to tell me if some properties are missing. Then this implements the nav menu, the alt menu, and the home translations. And each of those just contain the properties that are expected for that. And what I did to make a similar application as I just showed you, I added the Blazor local storage package simply to do something similar, to get and set the preferred language into the local storage or from the local storage. And I added this language state, which will contain the value after it's fetched from the local storage. Let's first take a look at the language selector that I made. Layout language selector, similarly as you saw before, only this is the select box. I didn't use the add bind, I used the onChange because I wanted to set this state with this language. I could have used the add bind and then the setter of the selected language, maybe, well, of some property. Okay, and I have this language state layout on language changed at the top. I included this on every page. Maybe you could include it just on the main layout, but I didn't get that to work. Let's take a look at that. So let's first go to the state. And I have a backing field selected language, and then the property selected language. This one is default. I inject the local storage, and I made my own event we'll see that later, to notify each time the language selection changed. And of course, we only want to notify the component when the value is actually different, not that we accidentally reset the same language. So then we invoke that to notify all the rest, and then we update the backing field. Set the language preference, just setting the past language into the local storage. Sets the property and notifies the changed thingy. And init language preference is, well, I'll call that whenever the app starts up, either on the main layout or on the component. And that just simply gets that language value from the local storage. I don't think you have to go all the way to implement that. I think if you just select a language, just re-render the current component to display the correct language, and then, for example, you navigate to another component that should then be in the correct language. Or you could, like the other example, force reload the entire page as well. That might be easier. I use that event notification system. That might be a bit over the top, but it's working fine. So let's see that language state layout. This is basically going to trigger a re-render each time the language preference changed to all of the components implementing that component. So a simple event listener on initialize, it's registered, and on this post we get rid of it. And when it actually changed, so I pass this has changed boolean. If it didn't change, nothing else, we invoke that selected language. And then on after render async, since init language preference is using the JS runtime, we have to wrap it in this conditional. Anyway, what this does is get the language from the Blazor local storage. And whenever that's set, that notification event triggers, which will then trigger this language change method and invoke to update the parent components with the value. So you saw that, I think, on the home page, and I just did it like that just to trigger that re-render. So the home translations are updated, and let's see, the nav menu should contain a similar approach. You could either get it nav menu translations to get only the nav menu translations, or you could just do if you want to access all of the translations, you could do it like that. But just to scope it per component, I did it this way. I'm going to run that. That's a simple Blazor application with interactive server on. And then we see it in here, the language toggling above. Hello world, welcome to your new application. Let's switch to Dutch. It's now in Dutch, and also the nav menu items. So now we've seen the official approach for a client-side Blazor project and my alternative approach. Let me know which one you like best. Of course, it's recommended to use the official one. And I'll likely put these translations into a NuGet package. That seems to be a good solution for my applications. Speaking of which, I've only implemented localization, or did an attempt to, a couple of times in my adopt.leisure.com, which is some kind of Tinder for shelter dogs, to adopt them. I started this application out in English because, of course, as an ambitious application developer, I thought this thing was going to go viral from week 2. Few years later, not so much. So that's my last tip for you. Really, really carefully analyze your target audience. I'm just going to make a number up, but let's say the first 100 active users are like 80 or 90% in one language. Maybe it's not necessary to support multiple languages right from the start of your application. And lastly, what about having translated content in your database or server side? So this would be an example of my actual applications. A content entity with a name, a description, a slug, a language, so in which language is this content, and the original ID. That might be the only thing that's consistent between all versions of this content entity. And you may wonder, like, how am I going to tell the backend and then the database which language I want? And I would simply say either you add the language on the as a request header when you do the HTTP call, get it out that way. You could even use you could set it on the HTTP client using a delegation handler, and you can maybe get it out, yeah, or just a middleware. You can likely get that header out, the language. Or you could simply add it as a query string parameter or a body parameter of your HTTP request. And then I have another variation. So either you could translate the entire row, or you could maybe only need one column to be translated. Then I would just work with a nested entity, either an owned entity or an actual new table for that, and just have all the language variations in there. So one required one, and then the translations. And then I have an example in the dog breed. So then the description is a multilingual entity, so can have the translations, because you might not always need to translate the entire row, maybe just one column. In this case, it could be good to also translate the slug and the name, but I'm using these aliases for that, just to have all of the variations on the dog breed and name, because it's not only the translation in this case, it's also like abbreviations. And then maybe one final thing is, let's say you have the weather page, you could probably have a route for each language. EN, for example, EN weather, and then French, Dutch, German. Let's see. Okay, that's all I have to tell you about that. I hope that's enough information for you to get started. Don't forget to check out Patreon/GizStupid and the gizcode.com website to get exclusive access to all of my best code, discounts, and much more. See you in the next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe on your way out.